Welcome to the Season 5 premiere of the Expert Series podcast from the CDA Institute, Canada's premier defense and security think tank. I'm Josh Malm, and it's Friday, January 9th, 2026. Thanks for tuning in, and if you enjoyed this episode, or if you've been following the series at all, please consider subscribing to our YouTube channel and following us on your preferred streaming platforms. Before we get into today's episode, I want to share a few updates. First, the 2026 Ottawa Conference on Security and Defense will take place on March 4th to 5th at the Chateau Laurier in Ottawa, Ontario. This year we have an excellent lineup confirmed so far, including General Jenny Carignan, Chief of the Defense Staff for the Canadian Armed Forces, the Honourable Anita Anand, Minister of Foreign Affairs, General Mike Wright, Commander of the Canadian Army, and General Jamie Spicer Blanchett, Commander of the Royal Canadian Air Force. This year's conference will focus on how Canada can achieve 5% defense spending within the next decade and what it will take to get there. Secondly, each year the CDA Institute presents two awards: the Captain Nicolas Godard Award, recognizing a young Canadian who has made a significant contribution to defense and security, and the Ross Munro Award, which honors impactful journalism covering Canadian defense and security issues. To learn more about the 2026 Ottawa Conference or to submit a nomination for either award, visit cdainstitute.ca and navigate to the events and awards section on our homepage. Now, turning to today's episode, we'll be examining the recent U.S. strikes in Venezuela, the capture of President Nicolás Maduro, and President Trump's renewed discussion around the potential acquisition of Greenland. Let's get started. On January 3rd, 2026, the United States launched a major military operation against Venezuela, striking key infrastructure and capturing President Nicolás Maduro and his wife Celia Flores in a pre-dawn raid on Caracas. Washington framed the operation, codenamed Operation Absolute Resolve, as a law enforcement action supported by military force and citing long-standing narco-terrorism indictments against Maduro. The move immediately triggered international backlash, with widespread condemnation over violations of Venezuelan sovereignty in the UN Charter, even as parts of this Venezuelan diaspora celebrated. A few days later, the implications of the Venezuela operation widened even further. President Trump renewed his calls for a U.S. takeover of Greenland and explicitly linked the show of force in Venezuela to broader U.S. security interests and prompted alarm among NATO allies that Washington may be increasingly willing to challenge sovereignty norms, not just in Latin America, but elsewhere as well. Joining me to unpack the significance of these events and what to expect in the days and weeks ahead, we conducted 3 separate interviews over the course of this week. Our guests included Roland Paris, Professor of International Affairs and Director of the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa, and former Senior Advisor on Foreign Policy to the Prime Minister of Canada. We also spoke with Ben Rowswell, a consultant with Catalyze 4, who previously served as Canada's Chargé d'Affaires in Iraq from 2003 to 2005, and as Canada's ambassador to Venezuela from 2014 to 2017. Our third guest is Kamran Bokhari, a senior director at the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy in Washington, of which he is a key founder. He also teaches graduate level courses at Georgetown University and is a geopolitical analyst and strategic forecaster. To kick off today's episode, we'll begin with our interview with Dr. Roland Paris. Without further ado, let's go to the recording.
So before we really dive into some of the analysis of these recent events, I'm wondering if you might be able to quickly provide some context and walk us through what happened and how we got to the U.S. striking of Venezuela and capturing President Nicolás Maduro. Some prior context, obviously, is that there were ongoing tensions between Venezuela and the United States, even in the first administration. And of course, just before the new year, the United States released its national security strategy, which has been called the corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, or the Donroe Doctrine, as President Trump has personally stylized it. So wondering if you might be able to unpack this and provide your initial reactions.
Right. So you've laid out basically the context here. Another piece of the context was that the United States Trump administration is gradually ramping up tension and pressure on the Maduro regime, including by targeting speedboats in the Caribbean, a couple cases, I think, in the Pacific Ocean that were allegedly drug traffickers, and also by intercepting oil tankers that were sanctioned oil tankers, all to put pressure on the regime to reduce the source of income that it has from oil exports, including illicit oil exports. And then this was followed by the intervention that you mentioned which was, just lasted a very short time and kidnapped the president of the country, brought him back to New York, where he's standing trial now.
Dr. Paris, the stated rationale was that this was due to law enforcement and drug trafficking activities, and Venezuela was deemed a narco-terrorist state. Do you believe that the stated rationale is the actual rationale? I mean, after the strike, members of the administration, including Trump, openly talked about the need for American energy security, as they've done before, and Venezuela's vast oil reserves. So not to say that the strike was entirely about securing a sovereign country's oil reserves, but I'm wondering if you might be able to unpack what you think the strategic rationale, if any, was for the United States.
Well, doing that with Donald Trump is very difficult with the Trump administration for two obvious reasons. One is that Trump himself his whims drive the government in a way that previous presidential administrations was less true for. And secondly, because when you listen to him, he says so much and he throws out so many ideas that can be hard to track what his thought process is. But I think your question actually involves two questions. One is, what do I think the actual motivation was? And second, was the rationale, did it provide a legitimate basis or a legal basis for military action? If we just look at the legality, I'll leave it to others to judge whether it was legal under U.S. law, but international law prohibits the use of force outside of certain circumstances. Like, you can do that within the territory of another state with permission, like the American drone strikes in Nigeria on Christmas Day were done with the permission of the Nigerian government. So that wasn't a violation of Nigeria's sovereignty. Or it can be done with a UN Security Council resolution. That obviously wasn't the case here. Or thirdly, and most relevantly, it can be done in self-defense. But in international law, self-defense is self-defense against an armed attack or an imminent armed attack. And drug enforcement under no circumstances is viewed as a credible legal basis for intervening militarily in the affairs of another state, at least by most international lawyers. So it was pretty patently illegal in international law. In terms of what the motivation might have been, again, it's very hard to discern. It may have been drug enforcement, although the truth is that Venezuela is less of a problem than other countries. My understanding is that Venezuela doesn't produce fentanyl, and that the drugs shipped through Venezuela are largely cocaine heading for the European market. In addition to that, we'll have to recall that just 6 or 7 weeks ago, Donald Trump pardoned to the former president of Honduras, who had been convicted in a U.S. court and was serving a prison sentence for drug trafficking. So that seems like there's at least asterisks beside that justification. I think that, what we can tell from what he said is there's a couple more things. One is the oil. And he has repeated this over and over again, that when he was asked what the follow-on administration in Venezuela should do, what must it do to meet U.S. requirements, he says that we need to have full access to the oil and other things. That's close to a direct quote. And then thirdly, I think that this is a demonstration project in the sense that Trump has used this to say this is clearly showing that the United States, there should be no doubt that the United States is dominant in the Western Hemisphere. That's consistent with the national security strategy that you referenced earlier. And it's consistent with the language that he's been using towards other leaders, threatening that the same kind of behavior could be, that their behavior could elicit the same kind of U.S. reaction. He specifically said to the president of Colombia, for example, that he should watch his ass. And then we saw statements. That's a direct quote, by the way. And then we saw statements by administration officials just yesterday not ruling out the possible use of force in Greenland. So it was illegal. The motivations were unclear, but if you go by what Trump is saying, it seemed to be, demonstrating American control of the Western Hemisphere and the right that the United States has to have access to critical resources in Venezuela.
Now, building on what you just said there, Dr. Paris, is this as you mentioned, and as I was going to bring up, it's not just Venezuela, but we've seen, I think, what can be interpreted as threats against Colombia, against Greenland. President Trump has also designated that there are quote unquote narco terrorists in Mexico, which might provide some kind of justification for the United States to enter Mexico if they please. They, of course, have referred to Canada, it's been said jokingly, is the 51st state. Is this action in Venezuela the opening salvo in further displays of American dominance in the Western Hemisphere? Or as you kind of mentioned, do we think this is perhaps a bit more performative, a show of strength and something to signal to other countries around the world that America controls this region of the world?
Well, I think that, some people have said that the action in Venezuela is unprecedented, and that's just not true. It is another instance of American military involvement in Latin America that dates back to the 19th century. And the most recent parallel that has been identified is the U.S. military action invasion of Panama in 1989, where similarly they arrested the then president of Panama, Manuel Noriega. It was a very strange episode where Noriega took refuge in the papal nuncio's residence, I think the Vatican embassy, and was forced out by the U.S. military playing very loud music. That was the light side of an otherwise pretty serious episode. So we haven't seen anything quite like this since 1989 in the Americas, but there is a precedent for it. I think what's different this time is that it's attached much more clearly and explicitly to a version of the Monroe Doctrine, which is more explicitly imperial in its articulation than even the Teddy Roosevelt version of the Monroe Doctrine, and certainly much more than the James Monroe version of the Monroe Doctrine from the early 19th century. I mean, if you listen to what Trump's saying, he's effectively saying that the fact that the United States, that the Western Hemisphere, in a sense, belongs to the United States is justification in itself for the U.S. to use military action, or at least to demand the compliance of governments within the region. So this is a very raw spheres of influence concept of international affairs. And so this action in that context raises real concerns. I don't think that Canada's facing any imminent threat of invasion by the United States, but we're seeing a Trump administration and Donald Trump himself that seems more emboldened and comfortable with the idea of using military force. He clearly reveled in that operation and the power that demonstrated. Much more willing now, seemingly, to throw threats around. And so countries like Colombia, Cuba, perhaps Mexico, Greenland, territory of Denmark, those territories, the responsible authorities in those places, I think, should be taking this very seriously.
It's building on the spheres of influence concept and America's interests in hemispheric dominance. Some questions that have been asked by observers and experts have been, well, maybe this is meant to be a show of strength or maybe even a kind of deterrence for the global security environment. But is it conceivable that actions like these might just invite, China to invade Taiwan or invite Russia to further destabilize Europe by invading one of the Caucasus or another smaller country on its border? Do you think this helps or hurts the broader international security environment, actions like these?
I think that it hurts it. I wouldn't draw, as some people have, like this really clear direct causal arrow between this action and what Russia or China might do in the next few months or even beyond that. But it contributes to a further weakening of the idea that sovereignty and international law should operate as real constraints on international behavior. I mean, listen, if Xi Jinping were to decide one day that he was going to have a kind of snatch and grab operation, kidnap the president of Taiwan, bring him back to China, it'll be much harder for the United States, whether or not Trump is president, even beyond Trump, to make the case that that was wrong. Now, they might say we're going to oppose it on some power grounds, but to make the argument that it's wrong becomes harder. And so this spheres of influence logic, let's just be clear, it's a kind of fancy term, but really what it means is that constraints should not apply to powerful states within their immediate region. They should be able to demand compliance from surrounding states, and in the extreme, even do what they need to do, including militarily in the surrounding states. So the weakening of those norms makes the world more dangerous. Spheres of influence systems historically have not worked very effectively. Why? Because of resistance within the spheres and because the spheres inevitably bump into each other. This is much cleaner in theory than it is in practice. So, this is a movement toward one step. This is just one further step towards a more dangerous world. I wouldn't say hair on fire moment, like we all need to run to the barricades or, buy food and water and stash it in our basements. But what we're seeing is the gradual erosion of the kinds of international laws and rules that have provided a modicum of constraint on great power behavior. And I say a modicum because we've seen lots of violations of international law in the past. But it has provided some constraint, and those constraints, such as they are being weakened further.
As our audience will well know, a term we often use to describe the relationship between China and the United States is great power competition, and that strategic competition is driving a lot of developments in international affairs and global security for the past 10 or 15 years. China, of course, had investments in Venezuela. It could be considered an ally of Venezuela. How does this, in your opinion, impact the relationship vis-a-vis China or the balance of power between the two countries?
That is a super interesting question. And I think we need more time to know what the implications will be. On the surface, you would think that if the United States is successful at being able to, in effect, coerce the regime in Venezuela to comply with American demands, those demands will almost certainly include rejecting China's presence in Venezuela. I don't think it will actually include prohibiting the sale of Venezuelan oil to China as long as American oil companies are part of the profit making for selling that oil. But it has the potential to really weaken China and Russia and Cuba's presence and influence within Venezuela. I say potential because right now, as we are speaking at least, and this could change in a day or two or three, the residue of the Maduro regime has clamped down on dissent. It's seeking to reestablish itself, and it's unclear to what degree it will resist American pressure. So we'll have to see. More broadly, if the United States starts applying greater pressure on Latin American countries, Caribbean countries, to resist China's presence, especially Chinese investment in resource projects, then it could weaken China's position in Latin America more broadly. But there are other ways in which this action in Venezuela probably has helped China. For one thing, you have a pretty sizable armada of U.S. naval assets now in the Caribbean. They're not in Asia. And for China, that's good news. They're tied up elsewhere. Secondly, we've already talked about this. The very spheres of influence logic that Donald Trump is articulating in his so-called Donroe Doctrine is, it very much mirrors China's vision of its own role within its own region. To that extent, might help China indirectly. And then I think thirdly, the very naked imperial reasons that Donald Trump has given for this action, like we want your resources, give it to us now or else, actually helps China in making the case which it's been trying to make for many years now in the rest of the world, that the United States is a hegemonic power and China isn't. Of course, that's very rich because China uses its influence in coercive ways as well. But, this is bad publicity for the United States, so to speak. So we'll see how all of those things play out in the longer term.
Dr. Paris, you've been great. I have one more question just to tie it back to some relevance for our Canadian audience listening. But, I read Prime Minister Carney and the Canadian government's statement on Venezuela. It seems like it was trying to very delicately address the situation in Venezuela while not being overtly critical of Trump, as I think Prime Minister Carney has tried to do throughout his tenure so far in his dealings with President Trump. The two seem to have a decent relationship, at least publicly. This mixed with the fact that, and our editors may have to fact check me here, I believe, Canada exports about 25% of U.S. crude refinery input. And I think in 2024, Canada exported 4.3 million barrels of oil per day to the U.S. So assuming, if the U.S. is interested in energy security and if it can start refining Venezuelan crude, which has its own challenges, what situation does this put Canada in? And, I'm rambling a bit here, but we're currently entering a USMCA renegotiations. Tensions have proliferated between our two countries ever since the 51st state remarks. How is something like this impacting an already kind of strained and tenuous relationship between Canada and the U.S.? And what implications, if any, does it have for Canadian security?
Yeah, that's also a really important question. First, let me just briefly address the oil issue. And I am no oil industry expert, but my understanding from people who are is that it would take tens of billions of dollars in many years to be able to rebuild the Venezuelan oil industry. They're right now pumping less than a third of the amount of oil that was being pumped in 2013. And so we don't even know what the political conditions are going to be like in Venezuela tomorrow, not least years from now. And so there's a lot of ifs before we get to a point where you've got a huge amount of Venezuelan oil being shipped to the U.S. Gulf, and U.S. oil companies, or energy companies, which are clearly part of Trump's vision for the exploitation of Venezuelan resources going forward, and who Trump said he alerted to this operation before it even began. They themselves have to make decisions about whether they're willing to tolerate the risks, considering the tens of billions of dollars of investment that will be required. In the meantime, I think that the economic logic, and I'm not talking about the environmental logic, but the economic logic for Canada building another pipeline to the West Coast certainly continues. I don't think it's affected. We're already making more money from that oil that's being shipped to Asia than to the United States because it's going at the world price to Asia. And I expect that logic will continue to hold. Now, coming back to your question where you started, which was on the statement that Mark Carney and the Canadian government made after the Venezuela invasion. Listen, I think most Canadians appreciate what a terribly difficult situation the government finds itself in. I mean, it's a terrible dilemma. We're in a very weak position. So are many European countries. On one hand, we're vulnerable to economic coercion from the United States, and Trump has demonstrated that he, at the slightest insult, could respond, in a devastating way economically. And we are dependent on the United States for exports, and our effort to reduce that dependency will take years to play out. Also, this is a critical moment for the negotiation between Russia and Ukraine and the United States and Europeans about a possible peace agreement in Ukraine. And that's largely contingent on the United States being willing to support some kind of security guarantees going forward. So the Europeans don't want to alienate Trump. On the other hand, from the point of view of Canada, it's not just our economic security that's at stake. We gain our independence and our sovereignty in part based on these very principles of sovereignty, of inviolability of borders. And So when we're silent, or when we just make, vague noises about international law when it's being violated, then, if we don't stand up and say something when this kind of thing happens, then we do have to ask ourselves the question whether we're standing by while we see these very norms weakened. And remember, Canada is a resource-rich country in the Western Hemisphere. I'm not suggesting the United States is planning any military action against Canada, but Trump's interest in Canada is clear. And our sovereignty is not just based on our ability to reduce our dependency on the United States. It's also based on our, together with other countries, willingness to speak out for principles like sovereignty, the inviolability of borders, and territorial integrity. And I think that the government has been trying to thread this needle. I'm not going to criticize it because it's an incredibly difficult, impossible task in a way. But I think that if this kind of behavior continues from the Trump administration, there won't be enough simply to make vague comments about international law.
Recent U.S. actions in Venezuela, including the removal of its leader, have sparked debate about the limits of foreign intervention and the challenges of fostering stability in already fragile states. Could lessons from past interventions such as Iraq offer insights into the potential consequences for regional stability, governance, and migration patterns in Latin America? Observers are questioning how such moves might reshape norms around state sovereignty and influence international behavior, especially if other powers interpret these actions as loosening of limits on the use of force. As these dynamics unfold, countries like Canada face difficult choices about how to navigate their commitments to international law, sovereignty, and regional security. To build on Dr. Roland Paris' perspective, I was also joined by Ben Rowswell, consultant with Catalyze 4, and Canada's former chargé d'affaires in Iraq and former ambassador to Venezuela. Ben brings firsthand experience in Venezuela and will share insights on the challenges of external intervention, the importance of state sovereignty, and what these developments mean for the rules-based international order. Ben, as you yourself and other experts have pointed out, deposing a leader or instituting regime change, conquering a country militarily, that's all one thing. Sticking around, governing effectively, ensuring stability, that's quite another thing. You have the unique experience now of having served in two countries where the U.S. has been involved in a regime change or deposed a leader, having also been our diplomatic envoy to Iraq. Are there any lessons from Iraq that you think could be applied to the Venezuela case here? And what difficulties and challenges do you maybe see the U.S. facing in the immediate term as it aims to, as I believe President Trump himself said, run Venezuela?
Let me start with one area of commonality, and I think the most important lesson, and then get into some of the nuances. I think the lesson from Iraq and many, many other cases is that decapitating a government, having a foreign power decapitate a government of another country, to be more precise, is a bad idea. It will produce negative consequences. It's no coincidence that the interdiction in international law, the interdiction against the use of foreign military force to change the political character of another country, is at the very beginning of the UN Charter, Article 2. If there is anything called a rules-based international system, this is the granddaddy of all rules. You don't mess with the government of another country. You don't change the government of another country forcibly against its will. It obviously turned out to be a terrible idea in Iraq. I mean, terrible mostly for the Iraqis, who died by the hundreds of thousands with all of the events that followed from that disastrous decision, but also terrible for the Americans. I mean, Donald Trump once called George Bush's invasion of Iraq the single worst presidential decision ever made. And he was right, even though he's now changed his mind. It was a strategic blunder for the ages that severely damaged the United States' standing in the world, its reputation. It made it a whole lot poorer as a country than it would have been otherwise. They lost 4,400 troops. So now let me point to one obvious difference between the two. In Iraq, there was a ground invasion and occupation by a relatively large army, not large enough for the occupation requirements, but they did have more than 100,000 troops on the ground. And therefore, the United States did govern Iraq itself after the fall of Saddam Hussein. In Venezuela, they don't have a single soldier on the ground, and therefore they don't govern anything. And when President Trump claims to, quote unquote, control the country, he does not actually control the country. He believes that he can control Delcy Rodriguez, the interim president, to do as he wants. But this is a very rare case in international relations where the forcible change of a political composition of another country is limited to one single person. And, at a technical level, a military level, it's really quite impressive that the United States isn't even able to achieve that. But as impressive as it was, it's still a crime of aggression. And it still leaves the United States responsible for the events to come in Venezuela. That they now share responsibility for what this government under the control of Delcy Rodriguez does. And therefore, the United States will certainly come to regret January 3rd for many years to come. Just as they regret 2003.
The U.S. invasion of Iraq had knock-on effects on the Middle East and the region more broadly. Do you think we could see some negative regional implications in Latin and South America following U.S. actions in Venezuela recently?
Yeah, Venezuela is already a very unstable country to begin with. Any country that has a government that's detested by so many of its own citizens is inherently unstable, and that's why they've had to become more and more repressive over the years in a bid to stay in power in spite of their absence of any popular mandate, any legitimate popular mandate. That is why, as well, that there's been this massive outflux of refugees, of immigrants from Venezuela, which is the single largest mass movement of human beings in the history of our hemisphere, the written history of our hemisphere. 8 million people fleeing a single country within a very short span of time. So we're dealing with a country that's already incredibly unstable. What are the sources of instability? Well, one is a deeply unpopular government, rejected by its own population, hated by its own government, with its own population, that therefore has to engage in ever increasing levels of violence to remain in office. Well, that's still the case. And if anything, now that that regime enjoys the support of its erstwhile enemy in the United States, it's consolidating its power and therefore likely to further destabilize Venezuela and by extension the region. And then the second cause of this mass emigration from Venezuela is a disastrous economic position caused by terrible economic policies of the Venezuelan government under Maduro and Delcy Rodriguez. She's been completely complicit in all of the economic policy decisions of the country as well, in which there's now only one resource in the entire country that they can sell, and that's oil. And because it's a repressive regime, the regime uses oil revenues to pay people off and to stay in power, which means that they're not able to spend that money in the well-being of the population, and that's why there's been this collapse in economic standards, health standards, social standards, education standards, as the institutions of Venezuela have essentially crumbled under the misrule of this government. Fast forward to January 2026, the situation is likely to get worse. Now, the United States is saying that it will somehow improve the production capacity of the Venezuelan oil industry. I'll believe that when I see it. They kept saying that they would do that for the Iraqi power sector, and it never happened. But also, there's one other major political faction that needs to be paid off, and that's the faction of Donald Trump. And so the oil revenues of Venezuela might increase, absolutely, 5 or 10 years from now, but in the short term, it's going to be even further divided. So you've got two reasons to believe, I think, that Venezuela is less stable after the removal of Maduro, and therefore will be a source of greater instability. And then add to that the fact that the sovereignty of states, on which the very stability of the international order itself is very much in question. And governments that previously did not have to worry about hostile military action to remove their president or their prime minister are now going to be ramping up defense spending to make sure that they're not caught as defenseless as the Venezuelans were. So January 3rd has made the Americas a much, much more dangerous place than it was before.
And it would seem that this kind of foreign policy is almost at odds with current U.S. domestic policy, with this administration's focus on strengthening the border, administering ICE agents across the country to round up migrants, while simultaneously contributing to the instability of the region, which might in turn result in more migration towards the border. So it'll be interesting to watch.
I would predict that we're going to see an increase in Venezuelan emigration. Where those Venezuelan emigres end up is anyone's guess, but there'll be some knock-on effects for sure.
Ben, I'm wondering if we can also talk about the broader global implications of January 3rd, as you called it, in the strike and capture of Maduro. Some commentators have suggested that the U.S. may be acting strategically, that America is reinforcing its dominance, its control over the Western Hemisphere, spheres of influence, sending signals to countries like China and Russia, that it's focused on energy security. That said, an overwhelming number of commentators seem to be in consensus that recent U.S. conduct in the region, coupled with the president's remarks about Greenland, Colombia, and in the recent past, remarks about Canada as the 51st state, are ultimately destabilizing for global security, are eroding international norms, and potentially even disadvantaging the United States' own interests, as it seems to be turning to the blunt instrument of hard power instead of relying on its ample soft power, which it's accumulated over the decades. So I don't know how to phrase this any other way, but the U.S. seems to be alienating longstanding allies as well. I'm wondering if you can remark on maybe U.S. objectives here and what, again, comments more on the broader geopolitical implications of something like this.
Yeah, I take it from your question that when you're saying strategic, referring to sort of a strategy that has as an objective the stability of the international order across the board. I do believe the U.S. is acting strategically because it wrote a document that said, these are our sort of priorities, and then it's implementing them really quite faithfully. So that's a level of strategy of advancing U.S. dominance in the region. It's strategic at that level. But in terms of the stability of the global order, the United States is very deliberately changing the fundamental structural principle, or attempting to change the structural principle at the heart of the international system, which is the principle of state sovereignty and sovereign equality. Interdiction on the use of force, except in cases that are very, very clearly spelled out through a process of international law. And two changes that I think represented by the January 3rd strike will lead to a significant destabilization at the global level. Let's start with that narrower point about the use of force. Any relaxation on interdictions against the rule of force encourages other countries to use force. The international law emerged not because of a bunch of moralizing, Bible-thumping ideologues. It emerged from centuries of brutal interstate warfare, where national sovereignty and limits on the use of force were essentially a way of reducing eternal wars between different countries, all trying to gain an advantage of each other. So when you mess around that, it's not that you're risking moral opprobrium, that some finger-wagging Canadian is going to tell you you're being a bad boy. What it really means when a great power like the United States decides to flaunt international law is to say we don't believe in any limits on violence. And that just invites all the other powers to say, well, we don't believe in any limits on violence either. And you end up with more violence. So that's one outcome of January 3rd. It's now become that much more permissible to use violence as an instrument for achieving national objectives in international affairs. The third is at that level. The second point is at that level of structure. The United States is explicitly attacking the principle of state sovereignty and sovereign equality, with replacing it with a previous structure that dominated Europe, at least in the 19th century, which was that of great powers dominating spheres of influence, in which there was no constraint on what each of those great powers could do in its respective area over which it claimed authority or control. And the great powers, to some extent, colluded with one another to leave well enough alone. That order produced an incredibly bloody and extremely unstable world. It was tested in 2 world wars, and after tens of millions of people were killed, the nations of the world, including the great powers of the day, or led by the great powers of the day, said that this idea of competing spheres of influence between great powers is an incredibly lethal idea, and we need to find a more stable basis on which to organize the international order. So the United States is turning back the clock in its embrace of violence and encouraging others to embrace violence, and in embracing the incentives that most countries have in the world to respect the limits of the sovereignty of other states, and putting the rest of the world, any country that's not Russia or China or the United States, on notice that they might be they might be vulnerable now to any number of depredations by the great powers. So those are 2 dimensions, I think, in which the axis of January 3rd.
We released a statement after the strikes on Venezuela, and I think the prime minister seems to try and toe that very delicate, difficult line of not annoying or upsetting President Trump, but also kind of in concert with some of our European allies expressing sort of disapproval of what happened with Venezuela, and Canada traditionally, historically, and continues to be a country that tries to uphold and support the so-called rules-based international order and the values that allow Canada to maintain its status as a prosperous middle power. How is this relevant for Canada and Canadians? And what position or strategy should Canada stake out in as the U.S. kind of reorients its foreign policy?
So Canada is one of the countries that's most active in defense of the concept of sovereignty in international relations. We don't often phrase it that way because sovereignty hasn't been questioned to the extent that it has since the second Trump administration. So we tend to focus on other words and principles, multilateralism, international law, what have you. But really, it's almost everything we do is inspired by the concept of sovereignty, sometimes by pooling sovereignty so that we can achieve better outcomes for our citizens through cooperation with other countries, which might involve, reducing the margin of maneuver that our parliament has because we're in a treaty relationship. That's not the kind of sovereignty dilution I'm talking about. When state sovereignty itself is at threat, as it was in Iraq, Canada stayed out of that conflict, and on the basis that the United States did not secure the legal authorization to violate a country's sovereignty, which is a Security Council resolution. We stood up for sovereignty, essentially, for Iraq's sovereignty. In Afghanistan, we had our own very painful experience in confronting the power of the concept of sovereignty. I believe that we're trying to do something legal and moral and helpful in Afghanistan, but our adversaries, the Taliban, were able to embrace the concept of sovereignty and bring Afghans to their side by arguing that a foreign military occupation, even one that was designed to be helpful and benign, like ours, was an attack on sovereignty. And so since then, Canada has become ever more protective of sovereignty. We've withdrawn from a lot of the activities of Canadian foreign policy that we thought might might get too close to the line, like humanitarian intervention. You'll notice that even as Haiti is falling to pieces, there's not a single Canadian on the ground there. We would have been in there by the dozens or even the hundreds in the past to stop the suffering there. But because there's this question of sovereignty, we step well away. We've become much less active, apart from Venezuela, really, where we were quite active. Generally, Canadian officials don't talk that much about democracy anymore, to our detriment, I think, because it's a fundamental interest. But, it stirs the pot on sovereignty, and we have learned to be extremely vigilant about the concept of sovereignty. That might position us well now for an era in which sovereignty is under full frontal attack from the United States. And in my view, the kind of approach that we brought to Venezuelan democracy in my time as ambassador was founded on absolute respect for the sovereignty of Venezuela, that the leadership of the movement towards democracy must be led by Venezuelans, that the role of the international community is only to follow, not to direct whatsoever. And this is an area where Venezuela desperately needs some kind of international support for its transition to democracy, and through that to regain its sovereignty. And Canada already has this, sovereignty-friendly approach, because that's a central value of our foreign policy. So in some sense, I think our foreign policy is right for the challenges of 2026, if we decide that we want to project power and take the initiative.
The United States appears to be rethinking its global posture, focusing more on security and stability in the Western Hemisphere, while encouraging allies in Europe and Asia to take on greater responsibility for regional defense. At the same time, persistent instability in places like Venezuela raises questions about how the U.S. balances near-term risks on its southern flank with broader international commitments. As we watch these shifts unfold, analysts are asking what this might mean for long-standing alliances, continental defense, and the future of U.S. engagement on the global stage. Geopolitical analyst and strategic forecaster Kamran Bokhari, a senior director at the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy in Washington, examines the rationale behind recent moves in Venezuela, the shifting responsibilities of NATO allies, and the broader dynamics of great power competition. Kamran highlights the United States' renewed focus on its hemisphere, the strategic significance of Greenland, and Canada's relationship with the United States.
And could you maybe start by discussing the rationale of the U.S. strikes on Venezuela and the capture of Maduro? And could you maybe contextualize it within that recent national security strategy that was released just before the new year?
That national security strategy document made it abundantly clear what the U.S. focus will be in the coming years. If you look at how that document was laid out in terms of the different areas of the world that the United States would focus on, the Western Hemisphere gains the disproportionately gains the most amount of attention in that document. So, and then comes China and the usual suspects on the Eurasian landmass and the Middle East and whatnot. They're just sort of like lower priority. So the United States is focusing on retrenching from the world. There's a new geostrategy that's been in the making, that still is being operationalized, and it's a recognition. And this is a long time coming. It's a recognition that the international system, or what is popularly known as the rules-based international order, the liberal international order, that has outlived its usefulness in terms of a management tool for the world. And this has been going on for 30 years. We go back to the discussions right after the collapse of the Soviet Union about the utility of NATO. So we've been having this conversation in the United States and in the internationally, especially with allied and partner nations, that, okay, so what is going to be the U.S. posture? Do we need to be able to sort of be everywhere, play global cop everywhere? And so and if you look at public sentiment, whether it's on the left, whether it's on the right, there is a common denominator. They disagree on many things, but in their own separate ways, they just don't want U.S. resources going to the role of global cop, if you will. And so then you have to pick your battles, and disengaging as a superpower requires some sort of a systematic approach. And as much as the media would like to say, well, this is very transactional. I mean, that word has become a buzzword. I find it intellectually lazy because if you think about it, all diplomacy throughout human history has been transactional. One actor gives something and the other actor also exchanges that for something else. And so transactionalism isn't the problem, but what the problem is that when we look at it through these sort of partisan and politicized lenses, we miss the method to the madness, if you will. And I think that there's I wouldn't say coherent, but I would say a well thought out strategy on how to come up with a new system in dealing with this world. So that's the context that's driving all this. So if we're going to retrench, which we are, from the rest of the world, Eurasia in particular, and we're going to leave the heavy lifting of security and stability in those regions to the regional stakeholders, to allied and partner nations, then it makes sense for us to sort of say we're going to focus on the home front. One of the things that people don't understand is the United States is an oceanic power, and and therefore it needs to protect the oceans around it. And the southern flank has been vulnerable. Venezuela has been one of those places where Russia, China, Iran all have been playing. The chaos in Venezuela because of the Chavez Maduro regime has led to a direct impact on U.S. security, and it's not something that's long distance. It's felt right here. You can look at it from the lens of the narcotics trade. You can look at it from the lens of illegal immigration, and so. If we're going to sort of go back to the Monroe Doctrine, which we are with the Trump corollary, then you can't leave Venezuela as is. And there was an attempt to say, okay, let's do this diplomatically, and this isn't something the Trump administration has been doing. Prior administrations have been struggling as well. So what I'm trying to say over here is that there is it's not a trigger that we should be looking for or rationale per se. We need to look at what are the drivers for this action, and how long have they been bubbling up and basically in the making. And so that's sort of the context in which I would place this move to remove Maduro from power. And we can get into the conversation of whether this means regime change. Why is the regime, the edifice beneath Maduro still there? Those are all sort of interesting questions and ones that need debate, but that's the rationale.
So if the United States is not necessarily acting in an isolationist manner, but more or less is choosing to kind of quote unquote focus on its own backyard, Latin South America, the North American continent, is the U.S. able still to retain its status as global superpower if it does that? Does the U.S. no longer have an interest in supporting NATO, or do they just expect Europe to take that burden on themselves? And I guess furthermore, if we're pursuing this kind of more spheres of influence policy or Monroe Doctrine 2.0, what are the implications for international security? You've got Russia in Europe, you've got China in Asia. What happens if the U.S. steps away from the global stage a bit and focuses on its own backyard?
So if you look at the National Security Strategy document, there is a very important section in it with a subheading called burden sharing and burden shifting. And so what that means is that it's not that the United States is, cutting and running away. It's basically saying, why should we be doing it alone? There was a need at one point for doing it alone because post-World War II, the world was shattered. Both Europe and Asia were shattered because of the devastation of that war. There was the rise of the threat from the Soviet Union in the form of the Cold War. And there were scores of new nations that appeared on the map. And we did not want those nations and these devastated parts of Europe and Asia to be places for the Soviet Union, which was, a major challenge for the United States far more so than Russia and China are today. And so there was a rationale back then to do that heavy lifting. Anymore, Europe is prosperous. Asia is prosperous. And therefore, it's not, that same method isn't needed. There has been a cost to the United States, an economic, financial cost of all of that. There's been a lot of neglect on the home front. And so there needs to be rebalancing. So the United States is not pulling out, it's coming up with a new system of managing the globe. In other words, it's not forfeiting its status as a superpower, it's becoming more efficient. It's trying to find more efficient. And this isn't easy. We're talking 8 decades worth of a system that has to be shifted. And in institutions like NATO has to evolve. So in the case of Europe, we're asking the Europeans to take up the bulk of the responsibility and sort of say, okay, because it's only logical that Russia, first of all, Russia is not the Soviet Union. If it cannot conquer Ukraine, and we're approaching 4 years, then we really need to look deeply at, what is the reality of Russia. In my view, it's a third world nation with nukes. And I don't mean this pejoratively, I mean this descriptively. It is not the threat that we think it is. And if it is a threat, then, it's like saying that someone else should want to, pursue my desires more than myself. So Europe must want its security more than the United States. The United States is an ally of Europe. And allies help, but allies don't do everything for you. So in other words, NATO has to evolve. Is there going to be a European architecture? And there's a problem with that. I mean, we think of the European Union as some sort of a singular entity. It's not. It's 27 member nation states that are sovereign, and they all have different views on how this is going to move forward. The challenge is that NATO worked because the United States was in lead, and it controlled 2 critical institutions, SHAPE and SECURE, which were part of the NATO bureaucracy, and that was the command structure. Now the question is, can the Europeans find a way to work with each other? Can the French military work with the German military? Can the Germans work with the Poles? Where does Britain stand in all of this? So I think the old system is gone. I wrote about this back in February of this past year. And I'm saying I basically argued that the old order is gone, the new order isn't here, and we're in that sort of interregnum. And so that's basically what it is. And as far as China is concerned and spheres of influence, well, we're reaching an accommodation with China. China is not a military challenge at this point for the United States. It is developing its military capabilities, and military capabilities are not just how much hardware you have. Military might, or the lack thereof, is a function of humanware. It's about, experience. And those experiences do not come from war games. They come from actual conflicts and the experience gained and transferred generation after generation in an institutionalized manner. So China is not there yet, but China is a geoeconomic power and is a rising geotechnological player. And we recognize that. And therefore, this administration is trying to reach an accommodation with the Xi government. And China also realizes its constraints. China is sitting on a very fragile political economy. For all the talk of China being this powerhouse, why are they purging every other month, people from the PLA and the CCP if this is a very stable system? Why is it that their economy suffers severe structural problems? It's because there's a Chinese Communist Party that has grafted and borrowed Western capitalism, and it's a hybrid, and it doesn't work, and at least they're trying to make it work, but they're struggling. So I don't think they're going to have spheres of influence. I think that, again, and I would add multipolarity as another concept that's highly misunderstood. There is no multipolarity in my view. Why? Because multipolarity, unipolarity are kind of recycled terms from the original bipolarity from the Cold War. There were actually two poles around which different nations gravitated because they offered they were powerful nations with their economic bases, and not just that, they were offering alternative, competing, political economic models for other countries to emulate. After that, the collapse of the Soviet Union, multipolarity has become sort of this catch-all word where we say, oh, China's rising, so that's one pole. We assume it's a pole, but China has nothing to offer as a political economic model to others. So there's no system that is there. So what we have is great power competition. I think that's a much more accurate term. And then within that great power competition, we have to see what countries where. China has overtaken Russia. Russia is not, as I said earlier, what the Soviet Union was. And there are other middle powers emerging, like Turkey, like Poland, like India, and others. So this is the reality of the world, and it needs a new system.
So we started by having this conversation about Venezuela, and that's led us into this broader discussion about the rules-based international order and U.S. foreign policy, particularly spheres of influence. If the United States is shifting its foreign policy direction, and if the rules-based order, as we've known, is either ending or evolving into something different, that clearly has implications for middle powers like Canada. And in Canada, as you know, we often describe ourselves as just that, a middle power. We're a major energy producer, and we're deeply tied to the U.S. through oil exports. And we're also a NATO ally at a time when U.S. priorities around energy security and global leadership appear to be, or rather just are, changing. So from your perspective, where does Canada fit into this changing global order? And what are the strategic implications for us going forward?
I think Canada is an exception to sort of, if there is a new rule in the making, Canada will always be an exception to that. And it's because of geography. It is because the entire northern flank of the United States is Canada. And so there's just no way that, there's just no way that we cannot have sort of an exceptional rule or an exceptional relationship. Look at the level of trade. Look at how the intelligence agencies are integrated with one another. Border security agencies are integrated. Militaries are integrated. So if you look at sort of how we deal with border crossing from the Canadian border and Canadian airports and people from Canada, Canadian passport holders coming to the United States, they're dealt with differently than other countries. It's because of that special relationship. I think that's going to evolve too. I think there's going to be a more closer relationship between Canada and the United States. It's inevitable. The hard part is the engineering part, is how do we work it through the lens of politics? There are governments, prime ministers of Canada who have to sort of, if you will, appeal to their voters. Likewise, American presidents have to appeal to their voters. That's the politics part. That's where you figure it out. That's where the engineering happens. But from an imperatives point of view, I just don't see that relationship floundering. I actually see it strengthening. And I'll tell you why, because we're now trying to integrate Greenland as well into North America. And yes, there's a lot of talk about, are there going to be troops going to be sent in and is going to be a forcible takeover? Look, Alaska was, part of Russia and then it became part of the United States. Things happen. It's not always conquest. We shouldn't look at this in military terms. Certainly can't. I mean, if United States did not affect regime change in Venezuela and only pulled one person and his spouse out of the equation, then, to say that we're going to go and do something with Greenland, I think is a little bit far-fetched. I think there's a conversation that has to happen with Denmark, with the Europeans, with the Canadians, and that's going to happen. And I think that's where we are. But with Greenland and with sort of, this change in climate, the climate change thing that is happening is creating new realities. While Russia is not the Soviet Union, but it is native to the Arctic. Okay, so it does pose a threat to Canada and the United States. Uh, China today is not a military power, but it is, we can't assume it won't be down the line. And therefore, and Canada, China is also trying to play in the Arctic as well as in Antarctica as well. So we have to plan for these things. So I think these are all the things that will pull Canada and the United States more closer. If I had to sort of speculate, and I have no evidence for this, I would say that there will be a much closer relationship between Canada and the United States, a special one in terms of how we do business with each other. Uh, there is the European Union model, but that's a lot of countries, and it's in Europe. I think we'll be far more integrated together as two countries. And you don't know. I mean, with everything going on the southern flank of the United States, this may not just be limited to Canada and the United States. We may have sort of a North American Union, if you will, which would include Greenland, which would include Central America and parts of Latin America. But I don't want to get ahead of myself. I'm just trying to say that this is the architecture. This is what I see as happening logically.
Dr. Bokhari, we are approaching time, but I did want to press on that Greenland conversation at least a little bit before we depart. So maybe, the Trump administration has obviously declared the strategic importance of Greenland. For an audience that is viewing this unfold and interprets this as an act of aggression on part of the United States, what would you say to them? Like, what is the strategic importance of Greenland to the United States and North America? Could Greenland have some kind of vested interest in being part of some kind of North American Union? And then third part of that question, how do you see that integration happening?
Great question. And so I'll try to answer it. And I must admit, I don't have all the answers. First of all, we look at the world, and I have one right here. It's a two-dimensional map that's on everybody's wall. It has North and South America on the left, and then the rest of the world on the right. And from that point of view, Greenland looks like, well, it's its own thing. But if you look at a three-dimensional map, and you look at the Arctic Circle, and you look at, where it is, then it's a vulnerability point. And at one point, it wasn't, because we didn't have climate change. The Soviet Union was more interested in, expanding into Europe and Asia. And so it was sort of this frozen thing that, okay, so Denmark is taking care of it. That's fine. Reality changes. Geopolitical realities, strategic realities change. In the current climate, leaving Greenland as an outpost on its own, that the Danes cannot, on their own, protect. And and you don't have consensus in Europe on Russia, then how do you have consensus on this? So this is too close to home for both Canada, far more for Canada than it is for the United States. We're still south. There's a bit of a distant standoff. But it's not something that can be neglected. Just like you cannot have a Chavez Maduro regime doing business with Russia and China and Iran and creating all sorts of problems on the southern flank. We cannot have hostile powers taking over that part of the land. It cannot protect itself. If it has until now, there's no reason that will continue. In fact, everything that we're looking at says status quo cannot endure. So something has to be done about it. So there has to be, look, Germany still has U.S. forces after 80 years. South Korea still has U.S. forces, tens of thousands. So we need to be able to look at things strategically as opposed to emotionally. And there are interests, and those interests are economic, but those interests are strategic and security as well. So I would say that this is a work in progress. You can't integrate Greenland into North America without a U.S.-Canada understanding. And it has to work. It works that way. The good thing is there's NORAD. There are institutional linkages between security agencies. Canada is, yes, there's the Five Eyes, which includes the Brits, the Australians, and the New Zealanders, but Canada is still a step above. The intelligence sharing relationship that we have between the United States and Canada is, think of it as Five Eyes plus plus. And so I think that is sort of how I am envisioning it.
That's all for today's episode. The Expert Series is released every Friday. If you want to learn more about the CDA Institute, follow us on social media, visit our website at cdainstitute.ca, or subscribe to our newsletter for the latest updates on Canadian defense and international security. If you have comments or feedback about what you heard in today's episode, email Josh at cdainstitute.ca. I'm Josh Malm. Until next time.